Hi all, welcome to this presentation of our short paper for CHR on estimating the loss of medieval literature using an unseen species model from Ecodiversity.
The image that you see to the right of our opening slide is Fabrice di Carigine, a 13th century village in Tuscany, Italy that is nowadays permanently submerged underwater because of the construction of a large dam in the neighborhood. When the lake is temporarily drained, you can sometimes catch a glimpse of the village, but normally you can only see a couple of towers and roofs. It's a kind of modern Atlantis. This village is an excellent metaphor for the main problem that we confront in this paper, and that is the simple fact that the study of the history of human culture is hindered by the fact that we have lost a great deal of cultural artifacts over the centuries. This is especially true for pre-modern literature, which is our main focus today. We have lost many books over the centuries, be it accidentally due to bombings or fires, or intentionally when historical collectors disposed of duplicates. This explains our use of the image of Atlantis. We can only work from a very incomplete sample of the original population of literature that once existed. Today we'll focus on Middle Dutch literature, the vernacular literature that has been written in the Low Countries in the High Medieval period. More specifically, we'll focus on the so-called ridder-epic, or chivalric romances, containing the kind of narrative fiction that is so typical of the Middle Ages, for instance about King Arthur. Currently, we know of 75 works in this genre that altogether survive in 167 documents. Here, the difference between an abstract work and the documents in which that work has been copied is crucial. Before the printing press, all copies of works were hand-copied, so all these documents are manuscripts. We know for a fact that many of these manuscripts have been lost, and as a consequence, also many works. How representative is this sample of the full population that once existed? Scholars have published estimates in the past. In his literary history from 2006, Van Oostrom estimated that at least 100 works must have existed once, implying that at least 25% of the works were lost. For the documents in which these works have been copied, book historians assume that only 7% of the manuscripts have survived. We use these numbers as a baseline in our study. Let us review schematically some of the many routes via which this literature has been preserved or forgotten. To the left you can see circles with the distinct works that this corpus once comprised. Each work was copied into at least one document, but often there were more copies produced of a single work. In the simplest case, a document could survive and end up in a repository, like a library, archive, or private collection. Some manuscripts might have been completely destroyed in a fire, or they have yet to re-emerge because they haven't been properly catalogued yet. Importantly, often only fragments of a manuscript survive. I include such a tiny example of a scrap of a manuscript on the slide. How much has been lost of this literature? We turn to ecology to help answer this question. In this field, ecodiversity or species richness is a crucial concept, and for many reasons ecologists want to know how many distinct species live in a certain area. This can help them monitor the impact of ecological disasters such as the wildfires in Australia. But how does that work in practice? Well, they send in a team of observers who have to cover a certain area during a couple of weeks. Maybe using harmless traps, these people literally start counting animals. Of course, they will observe a lot of insects or smaller mammals, but they are very likely to miss many species during their campaign that are more difficult to spot, like tigers or wolves. And that is of course a major issue, because they know that their counts are inaccurate. And like medievalists, they are underestimating the actual richness and diversity of the species in that area. To account for the unseen species in a sample, ecology has developed a rich tradition of statistical methods. In our paper, we focus on a model, Chow-1, developed by Ann Chow, a Taiwanese biostatistician. To apply this method, we need to represent our data as so-called abundance data, in which we record how often each species has been sighted during a campaign. Of special importance are what we call singletons and doubletons, or the number of species that have been sighted exactly once or exactly twice. These are F1 and F2. The main assumption here is that the number of low-frequency species informs us as to how many species we did not observe. Mathematically, we use F1 and F2 to estimate F0, or the number of species that are out there but which were observed 0 times. Interestingly, this method is directly based on the code-breaking work by Alan Turing during World War II. We report the application of CHA1 to abundance data for the Middle Dutch epics and compare it to 2 other estimators.
The core assumption here is that we can treat the number of documents that still survive for a medieval work as a direct proxy for the number of sightings of a species in ecology. Here too we assume that the number of rare works can tell us something about the number of works that did not survive.
CHA1 is an unseen species model that can tell us something about the loss of medieval works. Equally relevant, however, is the number of lost documents. How big was the original population of manuscripts that once existed? For answering that question, we used an extension of Chow's method that means to inform field workers as to how they are doing on a registration campaign. Suppose that we have been able to establish F0, or the number of unobserved species. This model extension tries to estimate how many additional sightings we would have to do to observe each of these unseen species at least once. In our paper, we argue that this number can give us an idea of the number of lost manuscripts. How many additional documents would we have to discover in order to discover all works? When it comes to the previous research in this area, there's a big gap between the loss of works and the loss of documents. For the loss of works for the medieval period, there is very little quantitative previous work, such as a paper by Cuthbert. In book history, we should definitely mention the pioneering work by Egge and Brood, who applied a very similar model to printed works. Regarding document loss, we are on firmer grounds and there has been quite some statistical work. Most of this work is based on medieval libraries, of which the historic composition is still known. By tracking how many of these documents survive, one can indeed estimate document loss, but these estimates can be problematic. First of all, such lists are rare, and secondly, they come from privileged collection environments such as monasteries, so that we don't always know how representative these numbers are for other collection environments. The graph in this slide is a so-called species accumulation curve that sums up our main results. With the blue lines, we plot the number of works on the vertical axis as a function of the number of manuscripts on the horizontal axis. And this shows how many new texts you are likely to find as you discover more manuscripts. The solid part of the line to the left is the situation as we can observe it nowadays, but the dashed part of the line offers a peek into the future. It shows what would happen if we were to continue finding more manuscripts into infinity. This curve is asymptotic. It starts to flatten out at a given point. It estimates that originally there were at least about 152 texts, of which only 50% survives nowadays. The gray part of the graph shows the distribution for the estimate of the original number of documents. As shown by the dashed gray line, this method suggests that originally there were just over 2,000 manuscripts containing Middle Dutch chivalric romances. Of these, only about 8.1% would then survive. In this paper, we focused on Middle Dutch chivalric epics and we estimated the number of works and documents that have been lost to us over the centuries. The models offer an indication that we are currently underestimating the loss of works in this genre. It is very unlikely that only 25% of the works disappeared. Our best estimate would rather suggest something like a 50% loss, which does seem like a major correction. For the loss of documents, however, our estimates were surprisingly close to the previously published survival rate of 7%. Taking into account the considerable uncertainty, the fact that we even get a number in the same ballpark for our corpus is remarkable, especially because book historians base themselves on an entirely different kind of data. In our paper, we also report on simulations and other measurements that we could not cover here. We see this as an exercise in modesty. Accounting for what was lost puts a confidence interval on literary history, so to speak. If we understand how incomplete this sample is, we should probably be even more careful in spotting trends in this data, since we know that half of the relevant data points are absent. In our current work, we are expanding this research to other regions in medieval Europe, from French to Icelandic literature.
That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Do check out the paper and enjoy the rest of the conference.